What does Paul teach us about God's providence in Acts 27? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts 27, verses 27 to 38. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 27, verse 27. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 27, beginning at verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under the pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." And the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Paul has been sent by Festus to Rome in order for Paul to plead his case before Caesar. They had departed Palestine in late summer or early fall. They arrived in Crete after the Day of Atonement, meaning that by then it was late September or early October. Paul advised the captain to remain in Fair Havens on the island of Crete for the winter, as sailing on the Mediterranean Sea in winter was dangerous. The captain, though, didn't like staying in Fair Havens, for it wasn't really suitable to winter a ship in. So he decided to sail about 64 kilometers or 40 miles west to Phoenix on the island of Crete. This was a mistake, for even though when they set sail it was good weather, the weather quickly changed. A huge storm with a cyclonic wind encompassed the ship, tossing it to and fro. In order to save the ship, the crew lowered the sails, tossed much of the cargo and furniture overboard, but the wind was too strong. The ship was simply going where the wind blew it. The initial storm seems to have died down, but for days they couldn't see the sun or the stars in order to navigate, and the wind was still very strong. Coming to verse 27, we find that 14 days had passed. 2 weeks at sea in this storm since they left Crete, meaning that we're approaching November now for sure. They had not eaten in 2 weeks, and I'm sure they were wet and cold by then, so it is quite possible that sickness could have been afflicting some, if not most of them too. Now when Paul had told them that an angel of God appeared to him saying that they would all live, but the ship would be damaged and lost, forced to run aground on an island. The problem was, though, there was no land in sight. That is until the end of the 14th night, when the soldiers sensed that they were drawing near to land. How would they have known this? Well, we know that as we draw close to the coastal shelf, the depths of the water drops. The way for sailors who cannot see the land to be able to tell if they were coming close to land was to take soundings. The way to do this was to take a weighted object, attach it to a knotted string that would be lowered into the water and indicate how much of it had to be let out before the weight reaches the bottom. The depth of the water was measured in fathoms, with 1 fathom being about 1.83 meters or 6 feet. The plumb bobs shown on the screen were used for construction, not seafaring, but probably give a good approximation of that which the sailors would have used to measure the depth of the water. At first, the sailors measured the water depth at 20 fathoms, meaning about 37 meters or 120 feet. A little while later, they took soundings again, and the depth was now 15 fathoms, meaning 27.5 meters or 90 feet, telling the sailors that the water depth was rapidly decreasing. The problem was, it was still dark. They couldn't see the land, and so, fearing that they would hit the rocks on the shoreline, they dropped 4 anchors, praying that the day would come quickly so that they could see how close to land they actually were. With land seemingly so close, and it being a danger to remain on the ship if it hit the rocks, some of the sailors lowered the skiff, or that smaller vessel that usually was towed behind the ship, under the pretense of letting down the anchors, when in reality they were going to use the skiff in order to escape. Paul warned the centurion and the soldiers that unless these men stayed on the ship, they couldn't be saved. Why? Because the sailors were the ones who could manage the vessel. Nobody else was qualified. God had assured Paul that everyone would be saved, but there was no reason for anyone to try. So there was no reason for anyone to try to escape. Note here, though, that even though God had promised Paul through his providence that he would be saved, that promise wasn't a supernatural one. Paul knew that God would work through the sailors. Sometimes today, when we know some things that God has promised through providence, we think that we don't have any responsibility to act, forgetting that God works through the hands of men and women to accomplish those things. If these sailors left, it's not that God wasn't able to save Paul and the group. It's just that Paul knew that God was going to do so through the sailors. The centurion and the soldiers then cut the ropes of the skiff, meaning that the sailors had to remain on board. And thus, it showed the centurion's faith that he placed in Paul and indirectly in God. But even though the sailors remained and God was going to save them, getting to shore was going to require effort, which means that they needed to eat. So Paul took what bread that was left, gave thanks to God for his provision, showing us that we're always to be thankful to God no matter the situation, and then began to eat. Once all 276 persons had eaten, they'd lightened the ship of any remaining wheat, for they weren't going to need it anymore, seeing as how they were about to reach land. We'll conclude this chapter, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 27, verses 39 to 44, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.